Welcome to the world of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you guys so much for joining me in today's episode. This is a news and lore podcast which focuses on the Pillars of Eternity games as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. For those not familiar why we link all those games together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. And so as the theory goes, if we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, we can glean some insights about Avowed as it undergoes development. And so today, we're going to be taking a look at one of the 11 gods of the world of Eora, known as Woedica, otherwise known as Oathbinder. And if you've been paying attention to Avowed since the reveal trailer way back in July 2020, you might recognize that title. And since there is no news to go over, I think we could just dive straight into the lore.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
Now, today's episode will feature as little spoilers as possible, and if there are any spoilers for any of the Pillars of Eternity games and their narrative, I will give you a warning ahead of time and let you know how many seconds in advance to skip. Let's dive into the goddess Woedica. Who is Woedica? If you go onto the Pillars of Eternity Wikipedia, which is pillarsofeternity.fandom.com, you can look at the article for Woedica there, and it has all the main information that you're going to find on who this goddess is. Woedica, or Woedica, depending on which voice actor you're listening to, is a deity which is known by different names, including the Exiled Queen, the Burned Queen, Oathbinder, the Strangler, and the Queen that was, and then in brackets, and still is. A lot of these names have meaning behind them. The Exiled Queen and the Burned Queen, for example, have to do with her history with the other gods of Eora. Theoretically, Woedica was actually meant to be the goddess in charge of all the other ones. We can't confirm whether or not this is actually true or if this is just a claim that Woedica has that the other gods have not substantiated or confirmed or not. But theoretically, she was supposed to be the queen of the gods. And in rebellion to her authority, the other gods stripped her of her power and exiled her in some way. And in the stripping of her power and the exiling, she was subjected to Magren's fires. Magren being one of the other deities, the goddess of war. And so that's why we have the terms the Exiled Queen and the Burned Queen as the name for Woedica. Now, as for the names Oathbinder, the Strangler, and the Queen that was, I suppose the Queen that was would refer to her being the queen beforehand and no longer is. But as for Oathbinder and Strangler, what we have for Oathbinder are the domains of which Woedica is in charge of. To give a little context, the deities of Eora, they each have different divine domains that they're in charge of. It is a divine expression of their very nature. And so these gods are persons in their own right, and they, by expressing who they are in charge of certain domains of the Eoran life, of the Eoran world, and of reality itself. And in Woedica's case, her portfolio of divine domains are things like law, justice, oaths and promises, rightful rulership, hierarchies, memory, and vengeance. And so those are the things that she is in charge of, technically speaking. There is some things in the lore that suggest that vengeance used to be Skane's, but that she appropriated it after she became exiled as a deity. So the reason for the title of Oathbinder include the things of law, justice, oaths and promises, and rightful rulership. It's her association with those particular domains that give her that name. And since we see the word Oathbinder written in Adeiran runes on the sword for the Avowed Reveal trailer, we can safely assume that Woedica is going to be involved in some way with Avowed, or at the very least the Adeiran culture will be, which is one culture that revere Woedica as one of the main deities. And in fact, the Church of Woedica is considered kind of like the state church in the Adeiran Empire. And so you see that a lot there. Now, if Aedir or Woedica is going to be involved in Avowed, we should expect to see something like this going on. Perhaps there'll be a conflict in the narrative between the state church of Woedican Church with the people, or depending on where in the world we're playing. If we are playing in the Living Lands, as a lot of the leaked information out in the internet has said, then that would indicate that we are taking this Woodican belief system to a land that has not established Woedica as the main religion there, although they might worship her under a different name there, the natives of that area, that is. It's a relatively unexplored region. I've done an episode on it before. Check it out if you want to learn more about the living lands. Getting back to Woedica, it's kind of ironic that she is the goddess of justice, oaths, promises, law, etc., because Woedica has demonstrated plenty of times through your interactions with her in the the only two Pillars of Eternity games, that she is willing to disregard the rules when it's necessary to accomplish her own goals. And so she really subjugates the rules of the world and the law that exists. And I suppose this is, as being the goddess of law and justice, that she would have the authority to subjugate the rules if she really wanted to. After all, she is the one that upholds them, right? But this gives a real subjectivity to the idea of law and rulership in the first place. And Woedica being kind of at the top of the food chain, she can really do what she wants and just say that that is the capital L law of the world. So it's interesting to see her do that, even though she holds people to the law strictly. And in fact, that's what her other name, the Strangler, is all about. Each of the gods of Eora have a manifestation. They have a way that they physically manifest in the world if they choose to do so. At one point, they used to have large titanic bodies, but they're not using those anymore. So they just manifest in different ways. The most common way, and the only one that we know of in the lore for Pillars of Eternity for Woedica, is the Strangler. She's usually physically depicted as a woman with burned and weathered skin, and it's kind of leathery, and it looks like an old woman. And the picture we see is usually of a woman in fine robes, but it's been tattered and burned away and dirty, right? So picture that. You have this old woman with kind of this burned skin, wrinkled skin, and the clothes look like that of someone who is regal, but it's tattered and dirty and whatnot. But the thing is that this manifestation appears, say, on a road from one place to another, to strangle to death those who have not upheld their oaths, right? So the idea is that, like, if you're a person in the world and you swear on Woedica, or you swear on a stack of Vaoran Bibles, or you sign a contract or whatever, and you willfully or whatever break these oaths that you've made, then theoretically speaking, this manifestation of Woedica, the Strangler, could appear on some road somewhere when you're traveling from one city to another. And this, burned, tattered woman shows up on the road, and you're probably not thinking much of her, but then with the strength of a full-grown Amawan, she just strangles these people to death. So really, we're running into the manifestation of Woedica the Strangler. It's actually quite terrifying. As well, because of this, it is often the case in many cultures in Eora that the penalty for breaking contractual oaths is punishable by death, specifically by strangulation. So I would imagine in the Empire of Adir that this is actually practiced. That's the entire purpose of the Strangler, which is one of the names she goes by. And it's because Woedica holds very dear the idea of keeping your oaths. Now, Woedica being the goddess over law and justice and oaths and whatnot, you'll often find people that work in bureaucratic industries being followers of Woedica. So judges, lawmakers, lawyers, clerks of offices and whatnot, administration duties and things like that. You'll find that people that are in these positions often are worshippers of Woedica, or at the very least pray to Woedica quite often for guidance and for honesty and to uphold their oaths as well as upholding other people to theirs. In fact, there's even an entire kind of religious sect that you can read out in the Pillars of Eternity 2 guidebook. These people called, what's it called? The Champions of the Letter. The Champions of the Letter are a group that meticulously and thoroughly inspect all official documentation in Eora that they can get their hands on. They have no ties to third parties or whatnot, so that way they can remain objective as they continue their work. What they basically do is they find official documentation, and without judgment of right or wrongness, I suppose, they just go through it and look for clerical errors, and then push very, very strongly against the people who filed these official documents to fix those errors, and even go as far to not live in accordance with some of these official documents. Now, what that could mean is that these people who are the champions of the letter, is the name of this group, they might be living in a location where there's a constitution or there's a written law of how you are supposed to behave in this area of the world with these people and blah, blah, blah. But if the champions of the letter are going through and they find that there is even the slightest clerical error, then these people might refuse completely to obey the law or to, live in accordance with it. So they might refuse to pay taxes in Valia, for example, if there is not proper documentation on it. And they will uphold the Valian government to that standard until it is fixed. And they might even often accept imprisonment as a result of this. Like they stand firm in their belief that if it is not written down, if it is not contractual, then we are not going to abide by it until you fix it. And once it is, they are happy to follow the law and do so. So these are the types of people that follow Woedica. These are the types of people that worship Woedica, or the types of people that would pray to Woedica, that are very by the letter and like to follow the law to, the letter. And so when we look at the different empires and cultures in the world of Eora, if we discover that they follow Woedica, then it tells you a little bit about what their culture is like if they revere a god like that. So for example, the Empire of Adir. The Woedican church is essentially the state church. That's how revered and how followed Woedica is. That actually tells you quite a lot about the Adiran culture themselves, what kind of culture they are. Very likely, they're a very bureaucratic culture that have lots of documentation and proper ways of doing things and channels of authority, et cetera, et cetera. This actually tells you quite a lot that can go on. And this also gives us a lot about Avowed that we can speculate upon without even having any information about the game. Because if you look at the reveal trailer, there is Adiran influences all over the reveal trailer. And then the sword at the end of the reveal trailer has the word Oathbinder written on the side in blue Adiran runes, Oathbinder being one of the names of Woedica. And on top of that, the voiceover for the reveal trailer talks a lot about oaths and promises and whether or not it's worth it to keep. And it talks about a crown, which is also the symbol that they use for Woedica, a broken crown, which symbolizes her removal from rightful rulership as queen of the gods. We see Woedican and Adiran influences all throughout the reveal trailer, which could tell us something about Avowed. And actually, even the name Avowed is it's about oaths, it's about promises, right? If you avow to do something, then you are beholden to it. And so thinking about this and what Woedica's divinity within the narratives of Eora are, we can actually start to speculate what kind of things may or may not be happening in the game. For instance, is there going to be a faction within the game that uphold to the letter the laws that are found within the local area that we're finding? Are we going to at any point have to interact with that as players? Are we going to have to go into bureaucratic places and fiddle around with the documentation or find errors in the documentation, which might sound boring to some people, but I'm sure Obsidian will find a way to make it engaging. Is that one of the factions that we're going to belong to or fight against? Who knows, right? Are we going to run into the champions of the letter at some point, seeing people publicly protesting outside? They're not going to pay taxes until they fix the documentation, something like that. It's actually, it's quite interesting. The more you dive into Woedica, the more that we can speculate about Avowed and the things that may or may not be in the game. Now, I've mentioned that people who follow Woedica are things like lawyers and judges and whatnot, as well kings and lords, since, people, someone said this to me once, I think in Discord or on the Avowed cast, was that rulers like the goddess of rulership. And so kings and lords, people who are in rulership of others, will often be followers of Woedica as well. But besides that, there are other followers of Woedica. In fact, there's an entire paladin order called the Steel Garrote, which is an order dedicated to the Woedican church. They essentially are kind of like the police, right? So where you have lawyers and judges working in bureaucratic institutions, in the capital of a nation, we'll say, the paladin order of the Steel Garrote are kind of like your on-the-ground version of the clergy. They are the ones who are upholding the law. They are looking for people who have broken the law. They are tracking down oath breakers and bringing them to whatever the law demands the justice be, right? And the Steel Garrote have their own history in the world as well. And just like the priests of Woedica, they are known for their cruelty and steadfastness to the law. And this is where I'm going to take a quick sidestep and talk about gameplay mechanics of Pillars of Eternity. In Pillars of Eternity, if you play as a priest or a paladin, depending on what subclass you choose, that is, if you're a priest, depending on what god you choose you are worshipping, or if you're a paladin, what order you are going to give an oath to, depending on how you play the game in terms of roleplay will determine how strong or weak some of your abilities are as a class. Now, for example, if you are playing as a priest of Woedica or a Steel Garrote paladin, if you behave cruelly or rationally, and the game lets you know when you're doing that, then some of your abilities as a priest or a paladin will be increased. However, if you play benevolently or diplomatically, those same abilities will actually be lessened. Now, it's not enough to break the game, right? You're not going to, if you play as a Steel Garrote paladin and you're very benevolent and you're very diplomatic, you're not going to ruin your character to the point that you can't play them, right? But there are some paladin abilities and priest abilities that will be less effective if you're playing benevolently and diplomatically, because those two values oppose Woedican values. The two values out of the 10 that you can find in the game for role-playing mechanics are cruelty and rationality. It is my personal theory that the reason that cruelty and rationality are the favored behaviors of priests and paladins of Woedica is because the rationality of it talks about how they are establishing the law and they have everything written down and figured out. And anytime there is something that isn't figured out, they write out a new law for it, kind of thing. So everything is rationally figured out. Everything is written down and can be referred to. And the idea, I think, behind why Woedican worshippers favor cruelty in accordance with the game's disposition mechanics is because it's about not giving leeway to those who break the law, not showing favoritism to those who break the law, right? Which can come across as cruel. Now, keep in mind, for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, that I think there's only 10 dispositions that can be chosen from. So there's like cruelty, rationality, benevolence, diplomacy, there's aggression, there's shadiness or deception. So there's only 10 things to choose from because they're the only 10 that Obsidian made for the game. So even though there are clearly many, many more values and ideals in real life, when you're designing a game, you can only make so many, and they chose 10. So the two, cruelty and rationality being the things that they favor, that's what I think it's about. It's about the rationality of the law existing and following it to the letter, and cruelty in the sense of it is not favored. So no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, you are subject to the law, and there is no favoritism. There is nobody who is above the law. And that can sometimes come across as cruel, especially to the people who see themselves as superior because they hold themselves to the law. Now, that's something that I foresee being a problem within society itself, is that if you have this law written out, then there is a group of people that are able to follow the law very well versus another group of people who are not able to follow the law very well, perhaps because, they're just people who can't control themselves as well, but also perhaps because they are put into positions where they can't really follow the law. Like, what if you have to choose between, what's the classic one of stealing bread so that you don't starve to death, Sometimes there are people who are put in those weird positions, and so they can't follow the law to the letter, right? So this can appear very cruel in societies like that, where everybody is upheld to the law to that degree, no matter what. So there's kind of like a mercilessness to it, but it's also equivocal in the sense of nobody is above each other. So even though I think the idea is about no one is above each other in terms of the law, I think naturally, just through the course of social interactions, there will be people who are like, I am more superior than you because I follow the law and you do not. You are one of those people and I am one of the good people. And it is that us versus them mentality that quite often leads to a lot of conflict in the world. And I mean, look at the Avowed Reveal trailer, there's a lot of Woedican and Eteran influences, and we're already seeing signs of war and conflict in just that alone. So, I think that's kind of upheld through not only this fantasy history, but probably even real world history as well. Now, I want to take a step back a little bit and talk about Woedica within the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as the lore in which we're actually interacting with her. She is a huge character for both Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2. In Pillars of Eternity 1, it's not really talked about or revealed necessarily, but there's actually a lot of stuff going on with Woedica behind the scenes. And then in Pillars of Eternity 2, in one of the updates, you actually have a game mechanic where you talk to Woedica directly. about the things that are going on in the Deadfire Archipelago, which is where the second game is set. And so Woedica has got a huge presence in both of these games, which means her character has been very developed over at Obsidian, and there's been a lot of thought put into Woedica. And in fact, when you go into the Pillars of Eternity Collector's book, there is only I think 2 gods that have been sketched out and drawn in like a little statuette form, and Woedica is one of them. So there's something about Woedica and her backstory and her very inception as a creation that is important to the story of Eora. My personal interpretation of Woedica's importance in the world of Eora and the narratives for the Pillars of Eternity games is this idea of almost like religious level strictness to the law and beliefs that lead to all sorts of oppression. I think this because I think Josh Sawyer was the lead game designer for Pillars of Eternity 1, and I remember vaguely, it's been a while, reading up on an interview where he talks about his diving into history, since he does have a degree in history, and I remember him specifically mentioning something about medieval Christianity and stuff like that. And we don't have to get into it too far about knowing that there's a lot of history that was not positive. And I could see some parallels existing with the Woedican church or the Woedican beliefs. I don't know if this is actually true. And of course, being a person who is familiar with that information myself, that might just be a bias of mine coming up. But I think that might be one of the main influences of Woedica and the parallel that gets put into the Pillars of Eternity world. Now, in the Pillars of Eternity world itself, Woedica is often shown with another god, Skane. In fact, most of the time when you look up photos of Woedica on, say, like Google Images, you're going to find that Woedica is standing right next to Skane. And these two have a weird relationship, and people of the world of Eora are not really sure what's going on with those two. It appears like they're buddy-buddy and they're friends and stuff like that, but there's also speculation that they have some sort of divine relationship going on, because Woedica, having been theoretically taken down as the ruler of the gods, the queen that was, she is now exiled and subjugated and underneath the rest of the gods. And so she plots her rightful revenge, is how she describes it. Skane is the god of revenge and secret hatred. And so it kind of makes sense that Woedica and Skane would be allies for the time being, because she wants to seek revenge against the other gods. And Skane is the god of revenge, right? So it makes sense that he would kind of be subjugated to her. There is other speculation, of course, if you read up in the lore, that Woedica took the domain of revenge from Skane. Skane used to be in charge of revenge, and now, or vengeance, I guess, technically speaking. And Skane wants it back, and so he's kind of buddying up to her to eventually take it back. So is Woedica allying with Skane because Skane is a god that she, in a sense, has to pray to for power? Or is Skane friends with her all of a sudden because now she is a person that he can relate to? Like, oh, you're one of the people that are seeking revenge. I understand you now. So now we are allies. And, the queen likes to have a slave, and the Skane is referred to as the quiet slave. Maybe it's just some weird divine personality traits just meshing together really well. Who knows? But it makes for an interesting point. And me personally, I have an idea for a tabletop campaign that involves the interplay of those two, of Woedica gaining power, but the more she gains power, Skane also gains power because she is getting her revenge. There's a little bit of a tabletop role-playing game idea that I have there. I'm not going to get into it too much because I don't want to spoil it if I end up doing it. But it's a cool interplay, and I wonder at all if it'll actually come up in Avowed. If in the game of Avowed, we are fighting for the Church of Woedica, or for in whatever reason we find ourselves empowering Woedica, if that somehow brings Skane into the equation now. And now, before I start to dive full bore into some ideas about Woedica and her involvement in Avowed, I actually just want to take a sidestep and look at some tomes, some books, and some items that can be found in Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 that contain lore for the Queen That Was. And starting off actually with that name, the Queen That Was, there are 2 pieces of lore, specifically books, that you can find in Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 that are considered scripture, in a sense, for Woedican followers. One book is a psalm to Woedica, and the other one is The Queen That Was and Still Is. And so for these 2 pieces of scripture, I'm going to read through them and then kind of dissect it as we go. So the first one is a book in Pillars of Eternity titled The Queen That Was and Still Is. And it starts off with this. Dear sisters, do you still remember your first deliverance when you strangled your first wrongdoer? Did you see the moment when life became death? Could you see the instance when your victim realized that Woedica forgets nothing? When Woedica takes back her throne, you will face her with pride, knowing you have held your own oaths. Or will you be amongst the word breakers? So right off in this first paragraph, we're seeing kind of an attitude to devout Woedican followers. They are people who enjoy delivering justice for things like broken oaths. And they have titles for people who do that, at the end of this paragraph, word breakers, And they talk about, can you hold your head up high? Can you face Woedica when she comes back to her power with pride by saying, I upheld my oaths. I was an oath holder, and I dispensed justice by, and it says at the beginning, strangling your first wrongdoer. It's a strong way to start off in a kind of a scriptural thing, but, Woedica is a strong word of God. She doesn't parse words. She just goes right for it. Goes right for the throat. Back to the book. Woedica teaches vengeance and memory, and while she is in exile, we must be her eyes and ears that let no injustice slip from the record. We must be the clenched fist that silences the lying breath. When Woedica takes back her throne, all of the injustices that have slipped through the cracks of history will be righted. The villains hiding in plain sight amongst the innocent will feel the burned queen's choking grasp. Pray that you live to see the day when you will join our queen in this cleansing of the wicked. This second paragraph within this book kind of is, I guess, would be the inspiring part to those who are reading it. It's talking about how while Woedica is in exile, so she is kind of powerless, the Woedican followers are kind of her eyes and ears and I guess, hands and fingers in the world. And so they're putting this responsibility on themselves to uphold justice and to uphold it without any sign of favoritism, that anybody who lies, they go out and they punish for it. And so they're really giving themselves this divine authority to be the judges and executioners and the juries, I guess, a judge, jury, executioner, what people say, for the Woedican church. So it's really, the scripture is showing that they have this identity of separation, that like we are the good people and everyone else is the bad person, and it's kind of inspiring people who are within the church to maintain that identity of them and the other people as others. Getting back to the book. But now, my sisters, that we must be ready to see the end of our days without the return of our queen, for she will take back her throne, but it may be our daughters that serve the restored court. We must continue to live as if we always have lived, hated by the other faiths, even though we place justice above our own well-being. At least the empire of Aedir still holds our creed in proper esteem. It is a proper sign of respect that, by imperial custom, our clergy must oversee a contract for it to be legally binding. For who else understands the value of remembering one's oath than Woedica's faithful? And let us not count our current blessings, for we still enjoy the support of the Paladin Order of the Steel Garrote. They too understand that society is built and broken by the oaths and rules of its people. And so this third paragraph is kind of where we get to the boots on the ground level of stuff, right? It talks right at the start about the idea that perhaps Woedica, the queen that was, will not return in our generation. Perhaps the scripture says it'll be our daughters who serve in this restored court, the world restored to Woedica being in charge. Perhaps a different generation will be then. So we must live as if we might enter into that time, but we also must live simultaneously as if we won't. They will continue to live as they always have, which is hated by the other faiths for what they do, for upholding justice without favoritism. And the paragraph ends off with them talking about the Paladin Order of the Steel Garrote, which is what they consider a blessing right now, right? And so they even kind of saying our current blessings affirm that there might be a day when people are so against the Woedican church that even the Steel Garrote will not exist anymore. So count your blessings while I still have them is kind of what they're saying. So far, we've got these first three paragraphs where you're kind of like, it's a call to arms or a call to action or like an inspiring part, as well as forming the identity of who we are and who other people are. And then getting into a little bit more of the practical, realistic, everyday matters that go on with following this faith, right? And now there's one last paragraph that we will go through and we'll kind of close it up there. When Woedica takes back her throne, my family will know that I was right to commit my life to the exiled queen. When Woedica takes back her throne, the Strangler will stop being a story told to frighten our daughters, but a hero woven into parables that teach our children justice. When Woedica takes back her throne, she will bring her flawless memory with her. Every transgression, every crime, and every injustice will be revealed. When Woedica takes back her throne, even the gods won't be spared their due retribution. Right? And so this final paragraph kind of looks to the future of what this Woedican church believes will happen, and they hold on to that hope as kind of, it's like the fire in the engine of their hearts that just drive them on, right? Because they are trying to live a life that, realistically speaking, would be very difficult. Like, I don't want to say upholding the law is difficult because I'm a criminal or something. I'm going out and like breaking the law left, right, and center. But to uphold any law to the degree that the Woedican followers are talking about is nearly impossible. And I would go as far to say is actually impossible. I don't think there is a single person in existence that, if they are following a strict code of ethics or a strict moral law for either their culture or a subculture, whether it's a government or a faith group, what have you, I don't think there's anyone who can say that with 100% certainty and purity of record that you have obeyed every tiny detail of that law. I mean, how many people are average good people in our own society, I'm talking like living in Canada, of course, that, have, done little things, like speeding, which is something that so many people do, or, like I downloaded a song that you didn't really pay for or something like that, right? Like how many people have done these little things that everyone accepts that are technically against the law, but no one really upholds that part of it. These Woedican followers are saying even that is a breaking of the law and therefore turns you into one of those people. That's just kind of like my personal interpretation, because obviously people in the Woedican church think that they are complete followers of the law, right? That is The Queen That Was and Still Is, one of the scripture books for Woedican followers. This is kind of like an epistle, it is written by one believer to another set of believers. So it's funny, kind of paralleling it to Christendom again. It's kind of like one of the books in the New Testament of the Christian Bible, because it is a letter written by one person who is prominent in the faith to a group, which is a lot of the books in the Christian New Testament. Anyways, that's a side note. The second piece of quote-unquote scripture for Woedican followers is a book called Psalm to Woedica. So look at that. Woedican followers are not just, boring gray suit-wearing bureaucrats. They also have psalms. They also have poetry that they like to write, right? Because they're still people, so they have depth to them, right? So let's get into this psalm, this poetry that is Woedican, I suppose, in flavor. I'm not very good at reading poetry, but I'm going to do my best anyways. Ye exiles, ye broken, fear not the vengeance of the burned queen. She watches from her throne, ever vigilant. She hears the oath thou doth speak at her altar. She hears the oath thou doth speak in thine home. She hears the oath thou doth speak in the dark. For ye who would keep thy word, thou shalt escape the justice of her gaze. Beware, ye liars, ye unfaithful. Beware, ye with a hardened heart. Beware, for the eye of Woedica will not be blinded. She hears the sundered oath. She is not fooled by the winding path. She attends the broken promise. She sees the deceiver. There is no shadow too dark. Her gaze will find thee. Her justice will not be restrained. The fires of justice will never be quenched. The throne will crack. The law will burn. But the queen that was always will be, speaking not an untruth, or thy tongue will be bound. Remember thy place. Remember thine oath. Remember thy queen. Thus concludes of Psalm to Woedica, reading by Gingerino. So that's the entire Psalm to Woedica, and we see there an entire depiction of whose Woedica's character is. She is an all-seeing deity who hears every single thing, including the stuff that is in your own mind, and she upholds justice completely, and so hold on to your oaths and follow the law to a T, or her justice will be dispensed, and in fact it says her justice will not be restrained. So Woedica is a god to fear in a lot of senses. Like, if you are going to break the law, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble. I wonder if there is, like, if you really get into the church of Woedica, if there are, like, forms of penance, like if you have to jump up and down 7 times to be forgiven for an oath that you broke or something like that, right? Is there any way for a church follower or an average person in this faith to make up for an oath that they broke, to make up for some sin that they committed, or does it just everyone get strangled left, right, and center? Because I don't hear about that happening a lot in the lore. So there's got to be some form of penance that they have, right? It doesn't get explored too much, at least not that I saw when playing the game or reading up on the lore. There's got to be something. Maybe we'll see it in Avowed. Okay, so those are the two main pieces of scriptural lore that we see. And I'm not going to, with the same level of depth, dissect the rest of the stuff that we can see in the game world. I am just going to kind of glaze, or graze, whatever word it is, over the rest of the things that we can find here. So, for instance, there are some items, just like in other games, when you read the descriptions, that give us lore. And by reading the descriptions of these items, we learn more about the world of Eora, and in particular about Woedica and her followers. One such item is a greatsword called Justice. And the description for this sword, I'm not going to read the whole thing, because again, I'm just going to overview it, tells about the story of an executioner who fought a long crusade and grew kind of fearful against all the evil he was seeing. And he swore he was going to cleanse corruption from the hearts of everybody that he saw and execute someone who was a heathen. And so he goes out into the world to kind of go on this campaign, this crusade, but was eventually backstabbed, theoretically, by this own sword, or this was the sword that he was wielding when he was on this crusade. You can find this sword in the first Pillars of Eternity game. As well, you can look into, surprisingly, Skane cultist robes. So for the deity of Skane, you could read the description of their cultist robes. One thing we can learn from this description in the lore is that often some people will pray to Skane for justice in the hopes that he will appeal to Woedica for assistance. Because again, the idea is that Woedica is currently in exile, but for some reason Skane is in contact with her. So if you pray to Skane with a message of justice, perhaps Skane on your behalf will pray to Woedica and thereby have it answered, right? So it's kind of like taking a backwards channel to talk to Woedica when she is currently in exile by going through Skane. Another item that we can find is a club called Shattered Vengeance. It's a unique club found in Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. This club has a backstory written as its description. There was a small Rawatine village that a little girl was in, and she broke into a Woedican temple to steal this club to fight back against some oppressors. So at first when I was reading this, I thought, okay, this little girl broke into a Woedican temple and stole something, so she's going to get completely annihilated by Woedica. But surprisingly, despite this sacrilegious act, the girl prayed for forgiveness, and it was seemingly granted because she used this club to kill all of the invaders. They killed the captain, and the townspeople considered her a blessing by Woedica. And supposedly, by my best guess, it's that being the goddess of vengeance, that she was seeking vengeance for what these oppressors were doing to her village and her people, and used a Woedican artifact to dispense this justice. And that's my guess for why Woedica would have blessed this little girl and what she was doing, despite the fact that she stole from her church. The last item I want to talk about is Woedica's Strangling Grasp. That's the name given to a set of gloves found in Pillars of Eternity 2. Now, this is an apt description for the Strangler, which, if you'll remember, is the manifestation of Woedica in the world. This is what the description says. Woedica's most feared avatar, the Strangler, manifests in the world to punish oathbreakers. If tales be true, once the Strangler has marked a victim for death, no force or barrier can keep her from her justice. Traitors, usurpers, perjurers, and all manner of those who turn their backs on the solemn vow fear clutches of the strength of this goddess. These gloves, while unlikely those of the Strangler herself, contain a dreadful, vengeful charm. The leather along the knuckles is stretched from frequent clenching, and the palms are polished smooth. Now, I want to kind of close this episode by talking a little bit about Woedica in Avowed. I've mentioned several times already in this episode that we're probably going to see Woedica in Avowed, or at the very least something inspired by Woedica. One thing I'm curious about is, like, early in the trailer, we see this banner kind of floating in the wind a little bit against a castle, and it has the Woedican crown symbol on it with a sword going through it. And it makes me wonder if we are seeing a militaristic faction of Woedica in the game. And since we're playing in the Living Lands, which theoretically was invaded by the Aedir Empire, and since Woedica is known to dispense justice without favoritism and without mercy, it's very possible that they led a kind of religious inquisition through the living lands to, convert the heretics or whatever you want to call it, right? So the fact that we see this Woedican militaristic icon on the banner in the reveal trailer, and theoretically we're playing in the living lands, it makes me wonder if that's kind of what the narrative of the game that's going to happen, is that this militaristic faction's going to the living lands, and it's going to be a campaign of how they are trying to convert the people and how the people are reacting to it. That's what I'm wondering and speculating about. As well, I wonder quite a lot whether or not the Steel Garrote will play a significant role in the game of Avowed. Whether or not you are for or against Woedican's church, or whether or not you are a member of the Aediran culture or not. Is the Steel Garrote something that you are going to be happy to see in the game because they are kind of like a force for good in the game's narrative, or for your character anyways? Or are they going to be people that you have to fight against? Are they going to be people you have to watch out for? It's very interesting thinking about the Steel Garrote being basically like the boots on the ground clergy for Woedica, and being kind of the enforcers of the law, the police of the area. It's going to be interesting seeing how Obsidian handles the narrative of all that, and how our character will interact with that. It's kind of making me want to play a Steel Garrote character, actually. And I think you can only play that character's subclass in Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire. So I'm kind of interested to do a playthrough of Pillars of Eternity 2 with that subclass, maybe learn some more lore about the history of that Paladin order. So I'm very interested to learn more about them and speculate what kind of involvement they will have with Avowed. I've already talked a little bit about the connection from Woedica and the Church of Woedica and the Aediran Empire in Avowed within this episode alone, as well as other episodes, so I'm not going to spend more time and waste your time talking about it here. But there's a lot about Woedica that we can really get into. And admittedly, Woedica was one of the most uninteresting gods to me for the longest time. I'll be completely frank about that. Like, to me, it was just like, okay, she, does mean things to people and she likes to uphold the law, blah, 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 blah. But when you start to really get down to like, what is this going to impact the narrative for Avowed, kind of having this idea that Woedica is involved in some way, or at least a faction that worships Woedica, as well as the history behind the very inception of this divine character we call Woedica. Like, where did she come from in the minds of the developers of Obsidian? I have my own theory of like looking at the rigidity and mercilessness of some actions seen out by the church in our own Earth's history a long time ago. Like, I see some parallels in there, obviously, and it makes me wonder, like, where are they going with the narrative for Woedica? Because this is clearly a character in the meta-narrative of the game, which is important to the developers at Obsidian. And what role is she playing that we're not aware of yet, So that's kind of why I now find Woedica very interesting. And I'll have to thank the host of Avowedcast, Sora, who is a huge fan of Woedican lore and kind of got me on this path to look into it more, and I'm very inspired now to actually get into it a lot more. So thank you, Sora, for that. All right, so that is everything that I have to talk about in regards to Woedica, one of the 11 deities of the Eoran pantheon for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 and Avowed. I will say this right now, that there are some Pillars of Eternity nerds listening to this that are thinking there is a faction in this world that are very tied to Woedica, and a particular person that is very, very tied to Woedica that I did not talk about. Eric, why did you not talk about this faction and this person? And I'm sure you know the answer already, is that it is major spoiler for the first Pillars of Eternity game. So there's a faction as well as a person in the first Pillars of Eternity game that are connected to Woedica in a way that I didn't want to spoil the narrative of that game. If you're interested, if your curiosity is piqued at all about like, okay, what's this faction and who is this person, I highly recommend that you go play Pillars of Eternity 1 or watch some Let's Plays of it, or if you don't care about spoilers, you can look it up, or you can ask me directly and I can tell you. Thank you guys for joining me today. That is all I have for now. A quick update before I close off this episode. I've been having some issues with my PC where when I try to run games like Pillars of Eternity 2, I get 7 minutes in and the PC crashes. I have several ideas of the cause of this, each more expensive than the last to fix, so I'm going to be sending it in to get it officially diagnosed by someone, and then I can figure out how to fix it. That said, I don't know how backed up the PC repair people are in my local area, so I might have to record small episodes on my Anchor app on my phone in the future, at least for one episode, I'm guessing. That's just a heads up for those of you who are looking forward to the next episode. I just want to let you know that there might be a delay, or I might have to record on my phone, which will have a little less quality in terms of the audio, but I'll still want to put some content up for you guys. It'll just be probably a smaller episode. The second thing that I want to announce, and I don't think I've actually announced this on the podcast yet, which kind of surprises me, but I thought I should put it out there because I'm also very excited about this, is that my wife and I are expecting our first child. That's right. We'll be praying to the goddess of Hylia for blessings of safe and health as we go through this. So yeah, I mentioned this because around somewhere in February, the show might just disappear for a little bit. And that is because I will be in a zombie-like state just trying to survive, is at least what I'm told. So we're very excited for that, and it's super amazing. And I'm happy that the news is out there for people. We held on to it for quite a long time, but we let all the family and friends know a long time ago. Anyways, I don't want to ramble about this. I'm super excited about it, and I can't help from talking about it. And since it might affect some episodes early next year, I thought I should let you guys know. But anyways, that's all I have to say today. Thank you all for tuning in to today's episode of World of Eora, a news and lore podcast for Pillars of Eternity and Avowed. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I will see you guys next time.